Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Hari, for inviting me to present the work that we've been doing with Glass and Rian. Introduce myself, I'm Andres. I work at IHE as a lecturer and researcher in water services management, along with Glass Schwartz, who's the assistant professor. Some of you probably know him. And this is also the work of Rian Klosterman, who is the policy advisor for Vitens, the company which we'll be looking at now, and who was instrumental in getting the resilience approach embedded within their strategic plans. So let's get started. I'm going to talk to you about how this Dutch water utility has incorporated resilience into its daily practices, and we're looking at it through the lens of what is known as a magic concept. So that's a starting point. There's of course the question of, you look at the Netherlands and you think, well, particularly Vitens is the largest water utility here. They've achieved full service coverage for decades now. They boast one of the lowest non-revenue water schemes in the world, and they have secured financial stability. They achieve full cost recovery. They can spend part of their resources in projects. So why would you want to incorporate resilience? And as a backdrop to that, I wanted to look at the magic concept of Pollitt and Hoop with you, which says that magic concepts are concepts that, because of their broadness, their normative attractiveness, and their implication of consensus and global marketability, they have the capacity to transmit through boundaries and help different sides work together, as you can see from the concept. So they have a very large scope, which means that they can encompass a lot of different aspects. They tend to be positively perceived by the people who use them. It's hard to go against the grain on that. Key here is that they imply a consensus, so they sometimes have the capacity to obscure different ideas or different concepts, and again, aligned with that is global marketability, which is the fact that they're fashionable. People like to use them, and as you can see from us doing this research and you in that conference as you are now, there is an appeal to it. So in order to begin properly with Vitens, we need to take a look at context aspects. And the first one is Vitens comes from a history of mergers between different water utilities in the Netherlands. You see here that in 2002 they merged with 4 large water utilities to come together. You see in the maps down here that it's really a conglomerate of a lot of different water utilities that evolved through the years. There was a large push from the Netherlands government to begin merging these smaller water utilities to achieve economies of scale and make it easier to guide processes that they were in. And so you have the situation where currently Vitens, you can see here on the lower right map, is the largest one. Sorry for that. And they have, because of this merger history, they have a set of very different infrastructural schemes coming from each one of these water utilities that were merged. So there's not like an overarching infrastructural pattern or idea behind how the whole system works, which will lead us a little bit later to the clusters. So key context one for Vitens, they have a merging history from a lot of different water utilities. Second, due to its location, Vitens has a very strong preference, you would almost say dependency, on groundwater. The table you see here is from their strategy on what their preferred sources are. And you will see that on the far right, bank filtration, common here in the Netherlands, and direct surface abstraction are really not an option for them in terms of risks and the way they like to perform their processes. This, of course, puts them at a bit of a crux. The one thing that they do not have in hand, because of access to groundwater as is presented, it has to work through the government, through their abstraction permits. Vitens doesn't have a hold of its primary resources, and by that they mean that in order to access any and all forms of groundwater as a resource, they need to go through the administrative process of negotiating with the government entity at the time. And this is in the process of changing recently, where before it was the central Dutch government who would allow or give these permits to water utilities. But as the omgevingswet, or the environmental management laws, coming in, this has been decentralized to the provinces, and so now it's the smaller provinces in the Netherlands, the one who provide water permits for utilities. And this is crucial because before, the central government had a very clear stance that water was a priority, and so water utilities had a lot easier time gaining these permits, whereas the provinces, and we'll see that a little bit later, have different set of priorities where water might not be the primary ranking one. So the second context is, again, Vitens is very dependent on its groundwater, and access to groundwater, not surface water, not desal, groundwater. And third, and here we go to, again, how Vitens has structured itself, you'll see that they've divided themselves into 8 service clusters, linked somewhat to the structures of the previous water utilities that were there. The big challenge here for them, though, is that these cluster structures do not match the provinces. There's a mismatch between the administrative boundaries of the provinces and the clusters, the ones that provide access, legal access to groundwater. This raises a set of challenges which will lead us to see why resilience has become a very useful term for Vitens in their infrastructural strategy. So they've identified a set of trends and challenges that they are facing, and which beckons them to use or to become, let's say, more resilient. You'll see some of them are the uncertainty of how the water demand will develop. They're expecting a decline in consumption per person in some areas, but not in others. So this leads to a certain degree of uncertainty for their development plans, particularly in infrastructure. You also see that there's physical and spatial trends, such as climate change and nature having a higher regard in society. But they also have very particular technical aspects, which is a decline in groundwater quality due to the effluents from farming and from other industries. And they also have a key challenge, which is spatial pressure in the underground, and we'll touch on that a little bit further on. But it comes to the fact that because of the limited physical space in the Netherlands, both on surface and subsurface, Vitens now is beginning to have competition on how and when and for what they can use the space. And finally, some of the social trends that they find is, of course, new technologies, greater decentralization, that the citizen is more self-sustaining, that they're thinking more in a circular economy way, and there's a higher attention to health, a little bit more micropollutants, but we won't get into that here. So based on these contexts, these 3 key aspects, the mergers, the groundwater dependency, and the clusters, and these challenges, Vitens comes forth and provides their long-term vision on infrastructure, which they title Resiliently Ahead. For those of you familiar with Volk's work, this is highly inspired by the work on resilience by Carl Volk, mainly because the policy advisor has done academic and practitioner research based on Volk's work, and so he integrated it in the planning and in the process of developing the strategy. Now, what's curious here is Volk describes 3 main aspects that make up a resilient system. And it's persistence, so the ability to resist change; adaptability, the capacity to adapt to the forces that are coming into it; and transformability, which is very overview speaking. It's the capacity of a system to change due to the changing circumstances or its context. So for Vitens, when they look at these 3 pillars, they said, okay, persistence for us is similar to what we consider robustness in their engineering and planning terms. And by robustness, they mean the capacity to withstand shocks to the system. The second one, adaptability, they consider flexibility, which is how fast their system can react to unexpected changes, right? So how fast can it recover when some systems fail? A curious aspect here, of course, is that in this planning, Vitens looked at transformability and said, well, this doesn't really apply to our system, so they discarded it, and it's not explicitly present in their strategy. So just remember, robustness and flexibility is how they've translated resilience into their long-term vision on infrastructure. So how has this translated into how Vitens evaluates its processes? Initially, Vitens usually considered only the costs that needed to be paid to avoid risks. They very much focused on a fail-safe system, right? What we have here as Arend's fail-safe to safe to fail. For Vitens, the way that engineers and planners have designed these water systems has always been to be as robust as possible, to avoid failure at any cost. However, with this strategy, what they're proposing is that they need to switch their view into considering more about performance and how that performance level is defined, how that required performance is translated, becomes on a very case-to-case basis. And by performance, they refer to how well they're achieving their core processes, which is 24/7 supply of safe drinkable water. And so when they switch into this look at performance as a balance between the costs they can pay and the risks they want to accept, there's an inherent awareness or recognition that risks will happen, some failures will happen, and the question is, how do we deal with that? How are we going to balance these risks and costs? And it seems, from what we found in the research, that the underlying objective of this has to do with investment efficiency. So all these different water utilities with their different technical schemes, they're foreseeing that within the next 10, 20, 30 years there'll be a significant infrastructural overhaul because of the need from actualizing old infrastructure. And so in order to be strategic in how they invest in these infrastructures, they've considered now performance as something that is a balance of how much risk can we take and cost. And of course, this risks leaves the space to define within their areas of service which areas of service are more acceptable to fail for a certain amount and which are not. And of course, this is all framed on the idea that by taking this risk and by keeping a required performance level, which is how the whole company structured its performance contracts, it becomes a matter of how fast can they recover when failure occurs. So along with that switch, we also see that this resilient long-term strategy talks heavily about engaging stakeholders. It becomes a tool with which they more readily try to engage other stakeholders that before perhaps weren't as prominent. And we see it here, as mentioned before, from two spaces. One, the spatial competition. So in the Netherlands, there's an ongoing shift for the energy transition, and there's a lot of focus on using the underground for energy processes. Vitens recognize that currently their spatial claim, as it says here, is too big. Before they were the sole owners of the underground, but with the energy transition, different priorities come into play. And so they recognize that they need to start thinking differently. They need to approach their situation differently, because if they do not consider their spatial pressure on other activities, society can tell them to go into different sources, which again are not their preferred or desired source. That leads Vitens to use resilience as a sort of key term with which to engage and find common solutions. Additionally, and we see the second one here, it's the role of the provinces. So as I mentioned before, the provinces are now the ones that are in charge of providing groundwater permits. What has happened, paired with the cluster system, is that Vitens has developed, as the example here shows, Vitens developed a strategy to get water to a town which was outside of one of the provinces, with water from that province, from Overijssel. When they tried to do that, the province said, "We're not giving you that water, we need it for the expansion of our main city, Zwolle, so we won't supply it." So, Vitens here has proposed a solution which is based on their cluster borders, but as it is not aligned with the administrative borders, they have not gotten their preferred solution. And so again, what is highlighted here is that what may be resilient to Vitens is not necessarily resilient to their stakeholders. And that highlights again this need to engage and advocate and work together with other stakeholders. And that's why this is sort of an underlying, not sort of, it's a very explicit tone of the whole strategy. Together we achieve more, says the introduction to this resilience strategy by the board of directors. So one of the things that, again, this resilience thinking is changing within Vitens is a greater awareness and a more finessed strategy on how to engage with their stakeholders. How do we see resilience on the ground? So in our research we found that it seems that at the cluster level, because of the way that they're infrastructurally planning the development, they always will have two mains to service large service areas. At cluster level, the emphasis still seems to be on robustness, being fail-safe, whereby you do not want to provide room for failure. But when you go to smaller levels, town levels, the minimum level is about 2,000 connections, so that's 5,000 people. At this level, they are approaching it in a more flexible way, or at least that's what the strategy proposes, in terms of finding ways in which failures can be more readily accepted at these smaller scales, with the condition that there's a focus on recovering faster, so what Folk also calls engineering resilience. Finally, how is resilience changing within the company, the core aspect of what we were looking at? How are practices changing? So again, the engineers that have been working there, as the quote says, they've already been doing infrastructure and planning for the last 30 years. And their training has very much focused on providing negative robustness, which is a robustness that is far greater than what the system actually needs. This comes from their engineering training. It's very common from the engineering schools here in the Netherlands. And so there's inevitably a bit of a resistance from a lot of the engineers in adopting this idea that we should also develop infrastructure considering the possibility of failure, i.e. reducing that negative robustness. And that reduction in negative robustness is, of course, directly related to a lower investment cost, again, increasing your investment efficiency. Now, internally, how are they trying to change the mindset of their employees? They've done a couple of key aspects here. One is that they've developed teams, long-term vision ambassadors they call, which are supposed to meet with their colleagues and discuss what resilience means, how to use it, how to use the tools that are presented in the strategy, promote cases of success that they've had in their own projects, as a way to sort of disseminate this as a new form of thinking, introducing resilience thinking into the work floor against the natural resistance which we just talked about. Additionally to that, perhaps in a more performance for the employees manner, supervisors are now required to discuss with staff at least twice per year how they are planning on incorporating flexibility into their daily tasks. This is just recently being implemented, so the actual form of it is not known, but the fact that now it is being considered within employees' performance, yearly performance, shows that there is attention into figuring out how this can be done, and for employees also to recognize that they're going to be evaluated on it. And finally, the asset management department, the one in charge of this long-term vision, has been set up as the liaison, the hierarchical liaison, let's say it that way, between the board of directors and the rest of the company. So any changes that are coming from the board of directors to the company, or vice versa, any feedback that is going through the asset management department, which is focused strongly on disseminating this resilience approach and vision and how it will work. So you see that the practices are changing in terms of having promoters internally, having reviews that include it, and also structurally in having the operational unit that is closest to the board of directors be the one in charge of disseminating this vision. So, having looked at all of this, what can we draw as conclusions of incorporating resilience into a Dutch water utility? The first one is that resilience is about being pragmatical, right? There were 3 dimensions from the academic papers, but as they did not apply to Vitens, they picked the 2 that were most useful for them. And you see this throughout the strategy as well. There's a lot of tinkering and tailoring and selective decisions about how or what parts of resilience thinking and resilience theory are actually adopted and useful for the company itself. The focus, again, as I mentioned briefly, is on engineering resilience. Is this link to investment efficiency has to do with reducing negative robustness, which requires a far larger investment when things cannot fail, to one where we need to find a way in which we can return to as fast as possible. These last ones we see, of course, is that resilience becomes the way resilience is formulated has a lot to do with the context in which it is being grounded. So the biophysical environment for the case of Vitens, the historical merger process, and an outlook view into this infrastructural overhaul that is coming. So it's important to remember that because of let's say the magic qualities of resilience, it requires you to very well understand what the changes are that you're trying to address and where you want to go, so that it can be tailored, formulated, crafted in a way that serves that purpose, while at the same time remaining a tool with which you can discuss, argue, and debate with other stakeholders. For Vitens' case, for example, the energy companies and the provinces, how to find the best form of resilience. We also see, again, that resilience in terms of the processes happens at different levels. It's not that we are robust and flexible at all moments, but rather a combination of flexibility and robustness at different scalar levels provides the system to be considered as a whole as resilient. And finally, a reflection from our side is that although Vitens said that transformability, from Folk's definition, did not really apply to them, the changes that you see in the organization, in the staff, in how they're planning, what they're trying to do, these are all fundamental changes of how the system of Vitens as a company is working. And so you do see that by incorporating robustness and flexibility, or persistence and adaptability, there are hints of transformability coming into its implementation. So overall, as a final thought for you as you continue in this conference, is resilience is a magic concept because it speaks to so many people, because it's so broad, because it implies consensus. Who doesn't want to be resilient, right? That's the normative aspect. But the decisions of what needs to be made still remain. I mean, once the magic is taken away, hard decisions still need to be taken into account. And so the invitation here is, when you consider how to incorporate resilience, it's key to ask resilience for who, resilience to what, and resilience at what scales. Because as we can see, there's a complementary form of resilience that can occur. I hope this was helpful for you and probably sparked some thoughts as you carry on in your day with your conference. Best of luck and success with what you have ahead. Thanks again, Hari. Until next time.